They lied to you. They lied in textbooks. They lied in movies. They lied in museums. For over a century, they've been selling you a polished, pale-skinned image, Cleopatra, a dainty European beauty, lounging on a throne beside the Nile. They want you to believe Egypt's last great queen looked more like Elizabeth Taylor than anything remotely African. But here's the truth. They don't want you to know. Cleopatra wasn't white, and Rome knew it. Her story didn't start in a marble palace in Greece. It didn't unfold in a snowy European empire. It unfolded on African soil, in the heart of a black civilization that had been building kingdoms, writing laws, and studying the stars while Europe was still figuring out how to bathe. Cleopatra was the product of that world, a world that stretched from Nubia to the Mediterranean, from Kush to Alexandria, and the deeper you dig, the more the European fantasy falls apart. Let's start with the obvious. Cleopatra was born and raised in Egypt, not Athens, not Rome, and Egypt was not a European land. It was part of a black African civilization that had flourished for thousands of years. Its queens and kings were depicted with brown skin, braided hair, and features that mirrored the people of the Nile Valley and Nubia to the south. The dynasty Cleopatra was born into, the Ptolemies, originally came from Macedonia. That much is true, but here's what they don't teach you. After more than 250 years of ruling in Africa, they weren't the same people who first stepped off those ships. They'd intermarried. They'd blended with the Egyptian elite. They'd adopted local customs, and some had openly allied themselves with Nubian and Ethiopian royalty, the powerful black kingdoms just upriver from Egypt. Cleopatra herself was a product of that mixing, and likely far more African than the Eurocentric image you've been fed. Why do I say likely? Because the historical record is full of deliberate gaps. No one knows exactly who Cleopatra's grandmother, or even her mother was. And that's not a coincidence. That's a cover-up. Ancient sources were vague. Later Roman historians were biased. And modern scholars often speculate her mother was Greek, simply because it fits their preferred narrative. But evidence points elsewhere. There's strong reason to believe Cleopatra's mother was from the Memphite priesthood, an elite Egyptian priestly family with Nubian ancestry, deeply tied to the temples of Ptah. Others argue she may have been a royal from Meroe, the capital of Kush, modern-day Sudan, a kingdom that rivaled Egypt in wealth and power, and was known for its black queens, the Kandakes. Either option means Cleopatra's bloodline was rooted in Africa, not Europe. And here's the kicker, even the Romans who fought her knew this. That's why their smear campaigns against her were drenched in racist language. Roman writers called her barbarian, foreign and savage. They mocked her darker complexion and non-Roman features. They portrayed her not just as an enemy, but as an African enemy, dangerous, cunning, and alien to their world. If Cleopatra truly looked like a pale Macedonian princess, Rome wouldn't have needed to emphasize her otherness, but they did, over and over again, because they weren't fighting a European queen. They were fighting a black African monarch who had the power to challenge an empire. But this is just the surface, because Cleopatra's African roots weren't just in her blood, they were in her politics, her alliances, and the world she fought for. And once you follow those roots, the myth of a white Cleopatra collapses completely. To understand who Cleopatra really was, you have to stop looking at her through Rome's eyes and start seeing her through the land that shaped her, the Nile Valley. Because Cleopatra wasn't just born in Africa, she was Africa's daughter, and everything about her reign reflected that. Start with her lineage. The Ptolemies who ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great weren't some isolated foreign elite living above the people. They were forced to adapt. Over generations, they married into Egyptian priestly families to legitimize their rule. They adopted Egyptian religion, spoke the Egyptian language, and performed ancient Nile Valley rituals. By Cleopatra's time, the Ptolemaic dynasty had been African for nearly 300 years. Cleopatra herself was the first of her line to speak the Egyptian language fluently. She was crowned as a pharaoh in traditional ceremonies, dressed in the regalia of Isis, and portrayed herself as the living embodiment of an African goddess. That wasn't Macedonian identity, that was Nile Valley identity. But the story goes deeper. The Nile doesn't stop at Egypt's southern border. It flows from the heart of Africa, and Cleopatra knew the power that lay upriver. To the south was Kush, an empire in Nubia, whose queens and kings had once conquered Egypt itself. These weren't passive neighbors, they were equals, and sometimes rivals, but they were also kin. Cleopatra's Egypt and Kush shared more than a river. They shared religion, art, architecture, and royal bloodlines. Temples in both kingdoms honored the same gods. Royal families exchanged envoys and alliances. And Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty had restored Egypt's glory just a century before Cleopatra's birth. That dynasty, led by kings like Pa and Taharka, was unmistakably black, depicted in statues with dark skin and Nubian features. This was the world Cleopatra inherited, a world where Nubia wasn't a distant land, but part of the same civilizational ecosystem. And Cleopatra didn't just acknowledge that, she leaned into it. Archaeological evidence shows close ties between her court and the priesthoods of southern temples with Nubian origins. Ancient records speak of trade routes connecting her capital in Alexandria to Meroe's wealth of gold, iron, and war elephants. And diplomatic exchanges suggest that Cleopatra saw the Kushite queens, the Kandaks, not as foreign monarchs, but as sisters in sovereignty. This wasn't Greece, this wasn't Rome, this was Africa, and Cleopatra moved like someone who knew it. The European image of Cleopatra as a Greek queen in Egypt collapses under the weight of this evidence. She was born in Africa. She ruled an African kingdom. She drew power from African alliances. She was steeped in African religion, spoke an African language, and embodied an African goddess. Even the Romans, desperate to delegitimize her, could never erase those roots. So why does the myth of a white Cleopatra persist? Because Rome didn't just defeat her, they rewrote her. And that rewriting has shaped how the world sees her for over 2,000 years. But the truth refuses to stay buried. It's carved into temple walls, sealed in hieroglyphs, preserved in coins, and whispered in the bloodlines of Nubia and Egypt. And once you start following those clues, the European fairy tale unravels fast. Because Cleopatra wasn't a European queen who happened to rule Africa. She was an African queen who shook Europe to its core. For centuries, historians have repeated the same lazy line: Cleopatra was Greek. It's a phrase repeated so often that most people don't even question it. But that line is built on sand, and the cracks are easy to see once you stop reading the headlines and start reading the history. Let's start with the dynasty. Cleopatra was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals. That part is true, but here's what they don't emphasize. Ptolemy I arrived in Egypt around 323 BCE, 3 centuries before Cleopatra was born. That's nearly as long as the United States has existed today. Now imagine how much a family's bloodline and culture can change in that time, especially when they're ruling in a powerful African kingdom and marrying into local priestly families to maintain legitimacy. Ancient Egypt wasn't some isolated nation-state. It was part of a deeply connected Nile Valley civilization that stretched far south into Nubia and Kush. And those southern kingdoms weren't just neighbors, they were relatives. Egypt and Nubia shared gods, rituals, language elements, and royal bloodlines. Intermarriage was common between priestly classes and royal houses, and many high-ranking Egyptians, even in the Ptolemaic period, were of mixed Egyptian-Nubian descent. Here's where the story gets interesting. We know who Cleopatra's father was, Ptolemy XII Aloti, but Cleopatra's mother, a historical mystery, deliberately left blank in many records. Roman sources like Plutarch and Cassius Dio, who loved gossip and scandal, say nothing about her. Why? Because acknowledging her identity might have revealed something Rome didn't want remembered, that Cleopatra's maternal line was African. Many scholars, including Joyce Tildesley, author of Cleopatra, Last Queen of Egypt, believe Cleopatra's mother was part of the powerful Memphite priesthood, an Egyptian elite with deep Nubian ancestry. Others point to diplomatic records, suggesting ties to Meroe, the capital of Kush. The fact that her identity was never recorded is suspicious in itself. Dynasties tracked lineage obsessively, unless there was something they wanted erased. There's another detail most people never hear. Cleopatra's grandmother is also a mystery. Ptolemy IX's wife and mother of Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra's father was never named. Once again, scholars quietly speculate she was Egyptian, but rarely say what that really means. She could have been a woman of black African heritage, from the priestly or royal families of southern Egypt or Nubia. Two missing women, Cleopatra's grandmother and her mother, leave half of Cleopatra's lineage undocumented. Half. Yet historians confidently declare her Greek. That's not scholarship. That's wishful thinking. And there's more evidence, hidden in plain sight. Cleopatra didn't just rule Egypt, she embodied it. She was the first Ptolemaic monarch to speak Egyptian fluently, a language of the Nile Valley with African roots. She performed ceremonies as Isis incarnate, an African goddess whose imagery originated in Nubia. She embraced Egyptian religion and imagery so completely that Egyptian priests described her as the daughter of Ra and the flesh of Isis. That's not a European queen dabbling in foreign customs. That's a queen who was of the land she ruled. Even the art and inscriptions from her reign tell a story mainstream historians avoid. Statues and temple reliefs depicting Cleopatra show features that align with African physiognomy: broader noses, fuller lips, and brown skin tones. Early coins minted during her rule don't show a pale-skinned woman with straight European features. They show a queen with tightly coiled hair and distinctively African facial structure. Roman writers knew this. That's why they leaned so heavily into othering Cleopatra in their propaganda. Octavian, who later became Emperor Augustus, called her a foreign temptress and barbarian queen in his speeches to rally Roman support. Cassius Dio described her as exotic and alien to the Roman world. Even Plutarch, writing decades after her death, framed her beauty as something beyond Roman standards. They weren't fighting a familiar face from Greece. They were fighting a woman from Africa. And this is where the Greek Cleopatra myth starts to look ridiculous. Because if Cleopatra truly looked like a pale Macedonian noblewoman, why did Rome go to such lengths to racialize her? Why the emphasis on her foreignness? Why the obsession with painting her as a barbarian threat to Roman purity? The answer is simple: because she didn't look like them. Because she wasn't one of them. They knew who they were fighting, and they feared what she represented. Not just a powerful queen, but the continuation of an African royal tradition that stretched back millennia. The myth of a white Cleopatra didn't start in her lifetime. It started after her enemies killed her legacy, and Rome was ground zero for the rewrite. When Octavian defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony in 30 BCE, he didn't just conquer Egypt, he conquered its story. He couldn't allow the Roman public to see Cleopatra as a brilliant, legitimate queen. That would make his war look unjust. So he launched one of the first great smear campaigns in history. Cleopatra became the whore queen, the foreign seductress, The witch. Rome flooded the world with imagery of a dangerous exotic woman who bewitched noble Romans with her charms. And that smear stuck. Over time, the details of Cleopatra's life were buried under layers of Roman propaganda. Her ethnicity was rewritten, her brilliance minimized, her African alliances erased. Plutarch's Life of Antony, written nearly a century after her death, helped cement the caricature. Later Roman writers, eager to glorify the empire's victory, followed suit. They downplayed her African ties, ignored her linguistic and cultural fluency, and portrayed her as a European woman who just happened to rule Egypt. The erasure didn't stop there. Fast forward to the 19th and early 20th centuries, and European historians were rewriting ancient history to justify colonialism. A powerful black African queen who outsmarted Rome didn't fit the story they were trying to tell, so they doubled down on the lie. Museums repainted statues with lighter skin tones. Textbooks emphasized the Greekness of the Ptolemies, while ignoring centuries of African integration. Academic papers declared Cleopatra European on the flimsiest assumptions, often with no evidence at all. Hollywood finished the job. In 1963, the film Cleopatra cemented the image of a white Cleopatra in the global imagination, casting Elizabeth Taylor as the queen. A woman of British descent became the face of one of Africa's most iconic monarchs. That casting wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of centuries of narrative control. If they could make you picture Cleopatra as white, they could make you picture ancient Egypt as European. And if they could make you picture ancient Egypt as European, they could erase Africa's central role in the world's story. But the receipts never disappeared, they were just buried. Coins, temple inscriptions, and historical accounts still exist that contradict the whitewashed version. Strabo, a Greek historian who visited Egypt in Cleopatra's time, described the land as filled with dark-skinned peoples. Roman poets mocked Antony for kneeling to the Black Queen of the Nile. Early Christian theologians wrote of Egypt as the land of the Ethiopians. None of that fits the pale fantasy pushed today. Even modern science is beginning to challenge the myth. Archaeological studies in the Fayum region, where the Ptolemies often took wives from local priestly families, show Nubian and Egyptian genetic markers becoming more common over the centuries. Cleopatra was the product of that mixing. The odds that she was purely Macedonian are almost non-existent, yet the old lie persists, not because it's supported by evidence, but because it serves a purpose. A white Cleopatra props up the colonial narrative. It suggests that African greatness only existed under European rule. It erases the continuity between ancient Egypt and the black civilizations of Nubia, Kush, and beyond. And most importantly, it hides the truth that Africa didn't just have queens, it had empires that humbled Rome. That's why this fight over Cleopatra's image matters. It's not just about a face, it's about who gets to own history. It's about whether Africa is portrayed as a passive backdrop for European genius, or as the cradle of civilizations that shaped the world. And when you strip away the propaganda, the coins, statues, inscriptions, and historical accounts all point to the same conclusion. Cleopatra wasn't a pale European queen pretending to be African. She was an African queen who refused to bow to Europe. Rome thought they were dealing with another provincial ruler. They had no idea they were dealing with a strategist, so ruthless, so brilliant, and so unapologetically African that she would turn their empire upside down. Cleopatra was not a pawn on Rome's board. She was the queen flipping the board over, and she knew how to weaponize every resource around her, starting with Africa itself. From the moment she took the throne, Cleopatra began strengthening alliances to the south, not just with Egyptian priesthoods and nobles, but with the kingdom of Kush and its formidable queens, the Kandakes. These weren't minor rulers. These were warrior monarchs who commanded massive armies and controlled the trade routes of Inner Africa. The Kushite Empire had already humiliated Rome once, most famously when Candace fought Augustus's legions to a standstill decades after Cleopatra's reign. Cleopatra understood that Rome feared Kush's power, and she built bridges, not walls, to it. She tapped into Meroe's wealth, gold, ivory, iron, and war elephants, and ensured that Egypt's southern frontier remained fortified. Kushite archers, famed for their skill, often served alongside Egyptian forces, giving Cleopatra an edge if Rome ever decided to invade. These weren't just military moves, they were chess pieces placed far in advance, ready to counter any Roman play. But Cleopatra's genius wasn't just in armies and alliances. She understood soft power, influence, perception, and control over the story. She knew Rome prided itself on being civilized and superior, so she made sure Egypt, an African kingdom, looked like the beating heart of the ancient world. Under her reign, Alexandria became the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean, home to libraries, astronomers, mathematicians, and scholars whose work Rome depended on. She invited philosophers from Greece, traders from Arabia, and diplomats from Nubia to her court, all while keeping African priests and traditions at the center of power. This was her trap. Rome couldn't conquer Egypt without cutting off its own lifeline. They could invade the land, but they couldn't invade the legacy she was building. And Cleopatra herself was a weapon. She mastered diplomacy like few rulers before her. When Julius Caesar landed in Egypt, embroiled in a civil war, Cleopatra didn't crawl to him. She staged one of history's most legendary entrances, rolled into his chambers, wrapped in a carpet, and turned a Roman general into her ally. That wasn't seduction, that was psychological warfare. Caesar was powerful, but Cleopatra made herself indispensable. Egypt's wealth and Rome's ambitions became intertwined, and she used that leverage to strengthen her throne. Later, with Mark Antony, she doubled down on the same strategy. Antony wasn't just a lover, he was a military powerhouse, with legions under his command. Cleopatra secured alliances, bore children that linked her bloodline to Roman power, and tied Antony's ambitions to hers. She wasn't playing romance, she was rewriting geopolitics. And make no mistake, these weren't desperate moves from a desperate queen. They were calculated power plays from someone who knew that empires rise and fall, but Africa endures. Cleopatra was using Rome's arrogance against them, making them believe they were using her, when in reality, they were moving exactly how she wanted. Rome saw her as dangerous, not because she was beautiful, but because she was effective. She wasn't supposed to negotiate on equal terms. She wasn't supposed to turn generals into allies and kingdoms into networks. She wasn't supposed to wield Africa's power with such precision. Yet she did, and it terrified them. Because every time Rome thought they had her cornered, Cleopatra reminded them that Africa was no one's colony. Cleopatra's defiance wasn't just about survival, it was about sovereignty. She refused to let Egypt become another trophy in Rome's collection, and she used every weapon, cultural, political, and psychological, to resist. One of her most underrated weapons, narrative. Cleopatra knew Rome thrived not just on military might, but on storytelling. Rome didn't just conquer territories, it rewrote their histories. So Cleopatra weaponized story before Rome could. She styled herself not as a Ptolemaic ruler clinging to a throne, but as the living embodiment of Isis, the African goddess of fertility, wisdom, and power. Through temple inscriptions, festivals, and public rituals, she fused her rule with divine legitimacy that Rome could never replicate. This wasn't theater, it was strategy. In a world where divine kingship mattered, Cleopatra wasn't just a queen, she was sacred authority in flesh. That made Rome's job harder. They weren't fighting a rebel monarch, they were fighting a living goddess whose rule was woven into the spiritual DNA of the Nile Valley. She also rewrote the geopolitical map. Cleopatra strengthened Egypt's economy by expanding trade deep into Africa, linking Alexandria to Meroe, Axum, and trade networks stretching toward the heart of the continent. African gold, spices, and ivory flowed into Egyptian ports, making her kingdom wealthier and more essential to Mediterranean trade than ever. Rome couldn't ignore her, but they also couldn't control her. And here's what really stung. Cleopatra treated Rome not as a superior power, but as just another kingdom to negotiate with or manipulate. She spoke their language when it suited her. She played their politics better than their senators, but she never bowed. Even as Rome grew stronger, Cleopatra refused to let Egypt become a client state. That defiance enraged Octavian. It wasn't just that she had Antony, it was that she refused to accept Roman supremacy. She stood as proof that an African monarch could match and even outmaneuver the world's most powerful empire. And that was a message Rome couldn't allow to spread. That's why their propaganda became so vicious. Cleopatra wasn't just painted as a foreigner. She was painted as a threat to Roman order itself. Octavian called her Regina Meretrix, the whore queen. Roman poets portrayed her as a serpent corrupting noble men. Every insult dripped with fear, because Rome wasn't fighting a caricature. They were fighting the embodiment of a continent's strength. A queen backed by the wealth of the Nile, the armies of Africa, and the power of a legacy older than Rome itself. And even when Rome finally defeated her, it wasn't a clean victory. They didn't drag Cleopatra through the streets of Rome in chains, like they did with other rulers. They didn't dare. She chose her own ending on her own terms, a final act of defiance that denied Octavian the spectacle he craved. Even in death, Cleopatra refused to be conquered. That's the part they never teach you. Cleopatra didn't lose because she was weak. She fell because she was too strong, because she represented something Rome couldn't control. She wasn't just a queen, she was Africa's last pharaoh, the living echo of millennia of black rule, and a direct threat to an empire built on rewriting history. And Rome knew it. That's why they buried her story under centuries of lies. That's why they repainted her skin in textbooks and replaced her features in statues. Because if the world knew who Cleopatra really was, if they saw her as Africa's queen and not Europe's fantasy, it would blow a hole through everything we've been taught about power, empire, and history itself. The truth is this: Cleopatra didn't need to look west for power. She already had it. She didn't need validation from Rome. Rome needed validation from her. And long after their empire crumbled, her name still echoes across millennia, not as their subject, but as their equal. Rome was terrified of Cleopatra. Not just of her armies, not just of her alliances, but of what she represented. Because if the world saw her for who she truly was, an African queen commanding wealth, intellect, and influence greater than any Roman senator, it would crack the myth of Roman superiority wide open. So Rome did what empires always do when they're afraid. They rewrote the story. After Octavian defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony at Actium in 31 BCE, he didn't just conquer Egypt, he conquered the narrative. Octavian, soon to be Emperor Augustus, understood something powerful. If you control the story, you control how history remembers your enemies. So he launched a propaganda campaign that would echo for millennia. Roman poets and historians were his weapons. They flooded the empire with images of Cleopatra as a monster, a scheming seductress who bewitched noble Romans and nearly brought down the empire. Horace called her a deadly queen who plotted the ruin of Rome. Virgil described her as a foul disease. Propertius mocked Antony for becoming a slave to a foreign queen. The message was clear. Cleopatra wasn't a sovereign ruler defending her kingdom. She was a dangerous temptress corrupting noble men with her foreign charms. But look closer at those words: foreign, barbarian, disease. They weren't just political insults, they were racial ones. They were Rome's way of telling its citizens, she's not like us, she's from that other world. the darker one, the one we conquer. Cleopatra wasn't just being villainized, she was being racialized. Rome wasn't just fighting a queen, they were fighting the idea that Africa could match or surpass them. And this propaganda wasn't just rhetoric, it was a weapon. Octavian used it to justify his war to the Roman people. He framed the conflict not as a civil war between Roman leaders, but as a defense of Roman civilization against a barbarian queen. He needed Romans to see Cleopatra not as Antony's political ally, but as an existential threat, a foreign woman pulling strings behind the scenes. It worked. By the time Cleopatra died, her image in Roman eyes was irreparably stained. She wasn't remembered as a scholar who spoke 9 languages, or as a strategist who rebuilt Egypt's economy. She wasn't remembered as the ruler who defied Rome longer than any other African monarch. She was remembered as a witch, a temptress, a foreign invader, everything Octavian needed her to be, to justify his conquest. But Rome's rewriting didn't stop at propaganda. They physically erased her legacy too. Temples dedicated to her were defaced, statues were toppled or repainted, Egyptian inscriptions referring to her reign were chiseled away. Even her tomb, one of the most significant burial sites in the ancient world, vanished from history. 2,000 years later, we still haven't found it. That's not coincidence. That's what happens when an empire tries to erase a threat so thoroughly that future generations never question the official story. And yet, despite all that erasure, cracks in the Roman narrative remain. Coins minted during Cleopatra's reign still exist, showing a woman with distinctly African features. Ancient writers who weren't on Rome's payroll still speak of her brilliance and power. And archaeological evidence of her alliances with Nubia, her devotion to African deities, and her use of Egyptian language and law still speak louder than Rome's lies. Because propaganda can distort a story, but it can't erase the truth forever. Rome may have started the rewrite, but Europe perfected it. Centuries after Cleopatra's death, the same empire that feared her story was gone, but the same fear lived on. Because if Africa's last great queen was remembered as she truly was, it would challenge the very foundation of the European version of history. So they buried her again. During the colonial era, European scholars reshaped the ancient world to fit their worldview. They portrayed Africa as a continent without civilization until Europe arrived, a blank slate, waiting to be civilized. But Cleopatra's story didn't fit that lie. She was proof that Africa had empires that rivaled Rome. She was proof that African women had ruled nations, commanded armies, and reshaped geopolitics. She was proof that Africa didn't need Europe to teach it greatness. It already had it. So the scholars rewrote her again. 19th century historians started emphasizing her Greek ancestry, based almost entirely on speculation about her father's lineage. They conveniently ignored the missing records of her mother and grandmother. They dismissed evidence of her African alliances as irrelevant. They painted her not as an African queen ruling Egypt, but as a European aristocrat living abroad. The museums joined in. Statues were cleaned and restored, often lightening the skin tones carved by ancient artists. Paintings from the Renaissance onward depicted Cleopatra with pale skin and European features. Even when archaeological finds contradicted those depictions, they were explained away or ignored. And then Hollywood sealed the deal. In 1963, Elizabeth Taylor, pale, British and unmistakably European, played Cleopatra in a blockbuster film, watched by millions. It wasn't just casting, it was cultural programming. For generations, the image of Cleopatra wasn't an African queen, it was a white actress in eyeliner. And that's how most people still picture her today. But the lie is cracking. Modern historians and archaeologists are revisiting the evidence with fresh eyes. DNA analysis of remains from the Ptolemaic period shows clear African markers in the elite population. The presence of Nubian deities in Cleopatra's royal cult points to deep cultural fusion. Inscriptions show she spoke not just Greek, but Egyptian and likely other Afro-Asiatic languages. And new research on trade routes reveals how deeply her Egypt was connected to inner Africa, economically, politically, and culturally. Even the ancient writers they used to whitewash her betray their own narrative. Roman poets mocked Antony for kneeling before the Black Queen. Strabo described Egypt as a land of dark-skinned peoples. Early Christian theologians called it the land of the Ethiopians. None of this aligns with the European fantasy, and the pushback is growing louder. African scholars, artists, and filmmakers are reclaiming Cleopatra as part of Africa's story, not Europe's fantasy. Documentaries are exposing the colonial-era manipulation of her image. Museums are being forced to confront their restorations. Even popular culture is starting to shift, with depictions of Cleopatra closer to the truth than they've been in centuries. Here's the truth they can't hide. Cleopatra wasn't a guest in Africa. She was Africa. She wasn't a European princess ruling a foreign land. She was the Nile's daughter, born of African soil, tied to African gods, allied with African empires. Her power didn't come from Greece or Rome. It came from a continent that built kingdoms while Europe was still in huts, and that's why they've tried so hard to erase her. Because the truth about Cleopatra does more than rewrite one woman's story. It rewrites the world's story. It proves Africa wasn't on the margins of history. It was the stage itself. For centuries, historians could dismiss physical evidence by calling it ambiguous, but science is making that harder by the year. New methods, from DNA testing to isotope analysis, are pulling receipts straight out of the earth, and those receipts are rewriting Cleopatra's story all over again. Let's start with the Fayum mummy portraits, painted faces of people from Cleopatra's Egypt. These portraits, created during the same period as her reign, overwhelmingly show individuals with brown skin, curly or coiled hair, and African or mixed African features. These weren't slaves or foreigners. These were the elite, the class Cleopatra herself came from and ruled over. If the ruling class of her era looked like this, why would Cleopatra be the lone exception? Archaeological studies of burial sites from the Ptolemaic period reveal the same truth. DNA analysis of remains found in the Fayum Basin in southern Egypt shows clear sub-Saharan African markers, especially among elites and priestly families, exactly the groups the Ptolemies married into. These findings make the purely Macedonian narrative statistically improbable. After nearly 3 centuries of intermarriage, Cleopatra's bloodline was almost certainly a fusion of Greek, Egyptian, and Nubian ancestry, if not predominantly African. Even the geopolitical landscape proves it. Egypt wasn't culturally or biologically isolated from the rest of Africa. Trade, migration, and intermarriage with Nubia, Kush, and Punt had been happening for over 1,000 years before Cleopatra was born. African warriors served in Egyptian armies. African scholars taught in Egyptian temples. African queens, like Amanasha Cato and Amanator of Kush, ruled empires that directly interacted with Cleopatra's kingdom. The Nile didn't divide Africa, it connected it. Cleopatra's Egypt was part of that network. The science of isotope analysis adds another layer. Studies on mummies from Ptolemaic sites show that their diets were overwhelmingly Nile Valley based, rich in native grains, fish, and local fauna, not the Mediterranean heavy diets associated with Greece. That means generations of Ptolemaic royals and elites were living as Africans, eating African food, and drawing from African soil. Their bodies were shaped by the land, and so was Cleopatra's. And then there's the silence of genetic evidence. the absence of Macedonian markers that should be present if the Ptolemies truly remained pure. The reality is that after centuries in Africa, isolation was impossible. They adapted, they mixed, they became part of the land they ruled. Cleopatra wasn't an outsider looking in. She was the culmination of that fusion. Even mainstream historians are beginning to shift. Scholars like Dr. Sally Ann Ashton, a leading Egyptologist, argue that portraying Cleopatra as white is historically indefensible. Ashton points out that Cleopatra's maternal lineage was almost certainly African, and that the ancient sources themselves repeatedly emphasize her foreignness, foreign to Rome, not to Egypt. That single distinction changes everything. Imam called Cleopatra foreign because she was African, not because she was Greek. They mocked Antony for being enslaved by a black queen, not a European one. They fought not just a woman, but an idea, the idea that Africa could produce leaders equal to or greater than Rome. Now science is catching up to what Rome tried to bury. DNA, art, archaeology, and even ancient words are converging on a single truth. Cleopatra was not the pale European queen that centuries of propaganda painted her to be. She was deeply, unmistakably African, in blood, in culture, in language, in power. And that's why her image has been rewritten again and again. Because if they admit Cleopatra was African, they have to admit something bigger, that Africa wasn't on the sidelines of history. It was history. Here's the part they really don't want you to understand. Painting Cleopatra white wasn't just about her. It was about everything. Because once you rewrite her, you rewrite the entire story of Africa's place in the world. This wasn't an innocent mistake by historians who didn't know better. It was a calculated campaign, a deliberate distortion of history designed to serve power. Think about it. Cleopatra stood at the intersection of everything colonial Europe wanted to claim didn't exist in Africa. Intelligence, diplomacy, empire, strategy, scholarship, and leadership. She was the living contradiction to the lie that Africa had no history before Europeans. If the world remembered her as African, the narrative of European superiority crumbled, so they erased her, and they did it methodically. During the colonial era, European powers justified their invasion and domination of Africa by claiming they were bringing civilization to a backward land. That's hard to sell if the continent you're invading is known as the birthplace of astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and global trade. It's even harder to sell if the most iconic queen in world history was African and once humbled the mightiest empire of her time. So the story changed. Textbooks began portraying Egypt as separate from Africa, as if the Nile stopped being part of the continent once it crossed a line on a European map. Scholars started emphasizing Greek influence while downplaying thousands of years of African development. Cleopatra's bloodline became European in textbooks, not because evidence proved it, but because they needed it to be. This was more than historical revision. It was psychological warfare. It was designed to strip black people of their connection to power. If Africa was portrayed as primitive, then European conquest looked like salvation. If Africa had no kings and queens, then slavery looked like destiny. But if Africa was the cradle of civilization, if its queens rivaled Rome, then the whole colonial project looked like theft. Cleopatra was the perfect target. She was globally recognized, deeply symbolic, and hard to erase without rewriting everything. So they did. They scrubbed her image clean of Africa and dressed her in European skin. They replaced Nubian bloodlines with Macedonian fantasy. They took a queen whose ancestors built temples while Europe lived in tribal huts and made her a product of the very continent that once feared her. And the effect was devastating. For generations, black children learned history from books that showed Cleopatra as white. They grew up believing that greatness was something imported into Africa, not something born there. They were taught that power came from Greece and Rome, not from the Nile and Kush. That's not just misinformation, that's indoctrination. Whitewashing her wasn't about accuracy, it was about empire. Because if Africa was always great, then Europe didn't build the world, it inherited it. An empire doesn't want to be seen as a thief, it wants to be seen as a savior. The lie about Cleopatra didn't stop at her story, it spread like a virus into every corner of history. Once they succeeded in painting her white, it became easier to rewrite everything else. Suddenly, ancient Egypt itself, a black African civilization, was rebranded as Mediterranean. Statues with dark skin tones were cleaned, paintings were restored with lighter pigments, pharaohs were described as bronze or olive instead of brown and black. European scholars like James Henry Breasted coined terms like Near East and Middle East to avoid calling Egypt what it was, Northeast Africa. This wasn't random, it was part of a larger agenda to sever the connection between Africa and the ancient world's most advanced civilizations. And once that link was severed, the lies spread further. Nubia and Kush were dismissed as fringe kingdoms. Axum and Great Zimbabwe were called mysteries. Even the trans-Saharan trade networks were minimized, all to support the colonial idea that Africa was isolated, stagnant, and waiting for Europe to lift it up. Cleopatra's whitewashing became the blueprint. If you could erase Africa from its most famous queen, you could erase it from anything. And that's exactly what happened. European museums filled with African artifacts labeled them as influenced by Mediterranean culture. Academic journals questioned whether black Africans were capable of statecraft, even as they stood in front of pyramids built by black hands. Films and books portrayed the ancient world with pale faces and British accents, while the African origins of those empires were scrubbed from the narrative. And the damage wasn't just historical, it was psychological and political. Whitewashing Cleopatra helped justify the transatlantic slave trade by painting Africa as a continent without kings or scholars. It helped legitimize colonialism by framing European presence as civilizing rather than plundering. It fed centuries of racist ideology by teaching that genius, leadership, and empire were European traits, not African ones. But perhaps the most sinister effect was how it disconnected black people from their inheritance. Because when you erase someone's past, you weaken their future. When you convince them their ancestors were only slaves and not scholars, warriors, queens, and kings, you chain their imagination before you ever chain their bodies. That's what the whitewashing of Cleopatra did. It wasn't just about changing one face in history. It was about changing how billions of people saw themselves. It was about shifting the center of civilization from the Nile to the Tiber, from Africa to Europe, and making sure it stayed there. Yet, the truth has a way of clawing its way back. Every coin, every statue, every inscription they tried to bury is rising from the earth, demanding to be seen. Every new study, every re-examined artifact, every historian bold enough to challenge the colonial story is parting the smoke and revealing what's been hiding underneath for centuries. The lie gave birth to empires, but the truth can burn them down. And once people see Cleopatra not as a European fantasy, but as the African queen she truly was, the dominoes start to fall. Egypt reconnects to Nubia. Nubia connects to Kush. Kush connects to the empires of West Africa. And suddenly, Africa isn't a footnote in someone else's story. It's the author of the story itself. That's the real reason they lied. Not because they didn't know the truth, but because they feared what would happen if you did. Reclaiming Cleopatra isn't about arguing over a skin tone. It's about pulling back the curtain on a 2,000-year-old lie and rewriting the world that was built on it. Because when you strip away the propaganda and face the truth, Cleopatra becomes more than a queen. She becomes a symbol that Africa was never waiting for Europe to bring its civilization, a symbol that African women weren't confined to fields and servitude. They commanded armies, signed treaties, and bent empires to their will. A symbol that Africa wasn't a backdrop to someone else's story. It was the stage the world stood on. When you reclaim Cleopatra, suddenly the whole narrative of Western civilization starts to look different. Greece didn't give birth to civilization in a vacuum. It was shaped by Egyptian science, Nubian trade, and African cosmology. Rome didn't civilize Africa. It built its empire on African wealth and knowledge. And Europe didn't discover Africa. Africa taught Europe long before Europe had anything to teach. That's why Cleopatra matters. Because her real story doesn't just challenge how we see her, it challenges how we see everything. It challenges the idea that whiteness and power are the same thing. Cleopatra proves that an African queen could stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful empire in history and make them shake. It challenges the idea that women in the ancient world were powerless. Cleopatra shows us a woman who ruled without apology, negotiated with kings and generals, and shaped geopolitics with her words and will. It even challenges the story of empire itself. Rome wanted the world to believe that empires like theirs were inevitable, that conquest and domination were just how history works. But Cleopatra's Egypt shows us another model, one built on trade, culture, diplomacy, and strategic alliances, not just brute force, one that wasn't about erasing others, but weaving them into something bigger. And here's the part that shakes the foundation the most. Once Cleopatra is restored to her rightful place in Africa's story, she reconnects the entire chain of African civilization. She's not an anomaly, she's a link that connects the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom to the warrior queens of Kush, the scholars of Timbuktu, the traders of Mali, and the leaders of resistance across the diaspora. When you put Cleopatra back where she belongs, Africa's history stops looking like scattered fragments and starts looking like a continuous, unstoppable legacy. That's why reclaiming her isn't optional, it's necessary, because without her, the story of civilization is incomplete. And incomplete stories aren't just inaccurate, they're dangerous. They shape how people see themselves, they shape how nations justify power, and they shape how generations understand their worth. The truth about Cleopatra is a domino, and once it falls, everything built on the lie starts to wobble. Think about education. Textbooks around the world teach children that Western civilization is the pinnacle of human progress, and that Africa was a passive recipient of its gifts. That story is harder to sell if those same books admit that the most famous queen in ancient history was African. If Cleopatra is black, then Africa isn't a passive backdrop, it's the foundation. If Africa produced queens who outwitted Rome, then civilization didn't flow from north to south, it flowed from south to north. Think about race. Whitewashing Cleopatra reinforced the myth of white superiority. The idea that leadership, intelligence, and sophistication are European traits. Undo that, and the myth starts to crack. If Cleopatra was African, then the face of genius isn't just white. The face of leadership isn't just white. The face of power isn't just white. And once that myth is gone, it becomes harder to justify systems built on racial hierarchy. Think about gender. Cleopatra's true story isn't just about Africa. It's about womanhood. She ruled alone in a world dominated by men. She commanded armies, brokered alliances, and made emperors kneel, not as someone's wife or daughter, but as a sovereign in her own right. Reclaiming her means rewriting what we think women were capable of in the ancient world, and by extension, what women are capable of now. And think about the diaspora. For centuries, Black people around the world were told their history began in bondage. Their story, they were taught, started on a ship, not in a palace. But Cleopatra's story burns that lie to ash. It shows that Black lineage doesn't begin with chains. It begins with crowns. It begins with dynasties, temples, libraries, and laws. It begins with people who didn't just survive history. they shaped it. The ripple effect goes even further. Museums will have to rewrite placards. Schools will have to rewrite curricula. Movies will have to rethink how they cast the past. And most importantly, people will have to rethink how they see Africa, not as a continent of need, but as a cradle of power. That's what one truth can do. That's what one queen can change. And here's the thing, the pushback will come. It's already coming. You've seen the outrage every time someone suggests Cleopatra was African. You've seen the historian panels scramble to protect the lie. That's not scholarship, that's fear. Fear of what happens when the foundation shifts. Fear of what happens when the story changes hands. Because once the story changes hands, so does the power. So why does any of this matter today? Cleopatra's been dead for over 2,000 years. Rome is dust. The Ptolemies are gone. Why does it matter whether she was painted white or remembered black? Because history isn't just about the past, it's about the present and the future. The stories we tell about the past shape the world we live in now. They shape who we think we are, what we think we're capable of, and what we believe is possible. And for far too long, the story has been rigged, written to elevate one people and diminish another. Reclaiming Cleopatra is about rewriting that balance. It's about telling black children that their ancestors didn't just survive history, they built it. That they come from kings and queens who ruled empires, scholars who mapped the stars, warriors who defended nations, and diplomats who shaped the fate of continents. It's about showing them that power, brilliance, and leadership are their inheritance, not exceptions to their story. It's about forcing institutions to confront their lies, about making museums tell the truth, about demanding that schools stop teaching history as a story of European genius and African absence, about dismantling the myth that greatness is something that arrived in Africa instead of something that emerged from it. And it's about reshaping how the world sees Africa now. Because a continent remembered as the home of Cleopatra isn't a continent seen as helpless. A continent remembered as the cradle of empire isn't seen as a charity case. A people remembered as the descendants of queens aren't seen as second-class citizens. History changes perception, and perception shapes policy, opportunity, and power. This isn't just about Cleopatra. It's about reclaiming the entire stolen legacy of Africa. It's about linking her throne to Mansa Musa's gold, to the walls of Benin, to the manuscripts of Timbuktu, to the resistance of Nzinga, to the resilience of the diaspora. It's about showing that Africa's story didn't end with conquest. It was interrupted, and interruptions can be rewritten. Cleopatra's truth is a spark, and sparks start fires. Once you accept that she was African, you start questioning every other truth you were taught. If she was rewritten, who else was? If her image was stolen, what else was taken? And once those questions start, the lie begins to collapse under its own weight. And that's why this matters. Because when that lie collapses, people stop seeing Africa as the past and start seeing it as the future. Here's the truth. Cleopatra's story was never just about her. It was about you. It was about us. It was about every black child taught that their story began in chains. It was about every African nation told that its greatness only began when Europe discovered it. It was about every narrative that stripped Africa of its glory, its genius, and its throne. Because if they could rewrite Cleopatra, the most documented, most studied, most talked about queen in ancient history, they could rewrite anyone. If they could paint her white and make the world believe it, they could erase the Kushite queens, the Moorish scholars, the Songhai emperors, the Benin bronzes, the Mali astronomers. They could whitewash entire continents of achievement and replace them with stories of civilizing missions and gracious colonizers. That's why this lie was never just historical, it was political. It was about control. Because if Africa's legacy was erased, then Africa's people could be conquered not just physically, but mentally. If they could convince the world that Africa had nothing before slavery, they could justify slavery. If they could convince the world that Africa never built anything, they could justify colonization. If they could convince the world that Cleopatra was white, they could justify saying that Africa never produced greatness on its own. That's what this lie was for, and it worked for centuries. It shaped how the world saw Africa and how Africa saw itself. It convinced even us to forget. But here's the thing about lies. They crumble when the truth walks in, and the truth is walking back into the room now. Every coin, every statue, every inscription they tried to bury is shouting. Every DNA study they tried to ignore is screaming. Every forgotten chronicle from Nubia to Meroe is roaring, and all of it is pointing to the same truth. Cleopatra was not theirs to claim. She was ours. She was Africa's daughter. She was Africa's queen. And if they lied about her, what else did they lie about? The lie that started with Cleopatra is breaking, and the cracks are everywhere. Museums, once content to display lightened statues, are now being forced to answer for restorations that scrubbed away African features. Universities once confident in the Greek Cleopatra narrative are rewriting their syllabi. Documentaries once afraid to say the word African are now dedicating whole episodes to exploring her Nubian roots, and they're terrified. Because when one crack appears, more follow. If Cleopatra was African, then Egypt was undeniably African. Not Middle Eastern, not Mediterranean, but African. If Egypt was African, then so were its gods, its mathematics, its medicine, and its philosophy. And if those were African, then the foundations of Western civilization, from Greek science to Roman architecture, weren't born in Europe, they were borrowed from Africa. And once that's admitted, everything changes. The idea that Europe gifted the world civilization collapses. The myth of African inferiority collapses. The logic of colonization collapses. The entire story of power flips upside down, and that's exactly what they're afraid of. You can already see the panic in their reactions. Scholars who spent their careers defending the whitewashed Cleopatra rush to publish rebuttals. Politicians condemn documentaries for being revisionist. Social media erupts every time someone posts art of Cleopatra with brown skin. Why? Because they know this isn't about one queen. It's about the story of the world and who gets to tell it. And the more they fight, the more obvious it becomes that they're losing. Because the evidence isn't going away. Because people aren't swallowing the old story anymore. Because Black scholars, African historians, and unapologetic truth-tellers are tearing down the false narrative brick by brick. And once the truth is free, you can't cage it again. So what happens when the lie finally dies? What happens when Cleopatra is remembered as she truly was? A Black African queen who outsmarted Rome and changed the course of history. Everything. History doesn't just change in textbooks. It changes in minds. Black children grow up learning that their ancestors built empires while others lived in caves. African nations stop being treated as places to be developed and start being recognized as the cradles of civilization they always were. Diaspora communities stop defining themselves by oppression and start defining themselves by inheritance. When the story flips, power flips too. The countries that built their identity on the myth of superiority have to face the truth that they weren't the beginning, they were the continuation. The institutions that built wealth on Africa's erasure have to reckon with the fact that Africa wasn't a charity case, it was the source. The societies that called Africa uncivilized have to explain why their own civilizations are built on African blueprints. It also changes how we see resistance. Because Cleopatra wasn't just a ruler, she was a symbol of defiance. She stood against the mightiest empire of her time and refused to bend. She used intellect as a weapon. She turned alliances into armor. She showed that African power wasn't just physical, it was strategic, diplomatic, and unstoppable. That's the legacy they tried to erase. And that's the legacy we reclaim when we tell her story right. Most importantly, reclaiming Cleopatra connects us back to a lineage they severed. It links us to queens like Amanarinas of Kush, who fought Rome and won, to Ninjana of Ndongo and Matamba, who resisted European conquest for decades, to Yahya Asantewaa, who led armies against the British, to every African ruler, scholar, and visionary whose story was buried beneath colonial lies. When Cleopatra returns to her throne in history, she doesn't sit there alone. She brings an entire lineage of African greatness back with her. Here's what empires fear most. They fear memory, because memory turns chains into fuel. It turns shame into pride. It turns silence into revolution. That's why they erased Cleopatra, because memory is dangerous. And once that memory returns, there's no stopping what comes next. You can already feel it happening. Across the diaspora, people are rejecting colonial versions of history and searching for their roots. African-centered schools are teaching the truth about Nile Valley civilizations. Artists are reimagining Cleopatra with brown skin and coiled hair, reclaiming the image they were denied. Documentaries and books are exposing the academic fraud that kept her story whitewashed for centuries. And every one of those actions, every book, every painting, every conversation, chips away at the empire's power. Because once people know who they are, they stop asking for permission. They stop begging for seats at tables and start building their own. They stop accepting lies as facts and start demanding the truth. That's the fire empires can't contain. That's the fire they hoped to extinguish when they painted Cleopatra white. But they failed. Because the truth doesn't die, it waits. It waits in forgotten scrolls, in buried temples, in oral histories passed down in whispers. It waits for the moment when someone has the courage to say, "No more lies," and that moment is now. The story is shifting, the illusion is cracking, the mask is slipping, and the world is waking up to the reality that Africa was never behind, it was ahead, that Africa was never conquered in spirit, it was silenced. And silence can only last so long before it becomes a roar. They lied. For 2,000 years they lied. They told you Cleopatra was white. They told you Africa was nothing. They told you civilization started somewhere else. They told you power had a European face. But lies age. And this one is crumbling. Cleopatra was not theirs. She was Africa's, born of the Nile, shaped by Kush, allied with Nubia, and feared by Rome. She was a queen who made empires kneel, a strategist who bent history, a woman whose very existence defied everything they wanted the world to believe about Africa. They buried her under propaganda. They repainted her statues. They rewrote her lineage. They recast her story. But still the truth survived. In the coins they couldn't melt, the temples they couldn't destroy, the languages they couldn't silence. And now, the truth is louder than ever, because this isn't just about Cleopatra, it's about every name they erased, every statue they defaced, every kingdom they called tribal, every invention they stole, every ancestor they stripped of dignity in their books. It's about taking back the story that was stolen and telling it in our own voice. They lied, but the lie is dying. And when the lie dies, Africa rises, history realigns, power redistributes, pride returns. The children of kings and queens remember who they are. The roar that terrified Rome is rising again. It's rising in classrooms where the truth is finally taught. It's rising in art that refuses to whitewash the past. It's rising in voices across the diaspora saying, "We are not your myths. We are not your lies. We are the descendants of greatness." Cleopatra was not the end of Africa's story, she was the proof of it. And reclaiming her isn't just about setting the record straight. It's about tearing down every wall built on that lie. It's about reclaiming every inch of dignity, every ounce of power, every fragment of memory that was stolen. The empires that feared her are gone. Their statues crumble, their borders fade. But Cleopatra remains, not as they painted her, but as she was a black African queen who shook the world and dared to defy it. And now her story belongs to us again. Not the story they wrote, the story we will tell, the story of Africa, not erased, not whitewashed, not forgotten. The story of Africa rising. The roar is back, and this time, it's not going to be silenced.